Welcome back to the channel. In this episode, we are exploring one of the longest-running and most complex civil conflicts in modern history, the Colombian Civil War, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia versus the government of the Republic of Colombia. This conflict was not a simple binary war. It was an intricate web of class struggle, ideological warfare, narcotics trafficking, paramilitary violence, and evolving peace processes. Stay with us as we examine the deep-level history of this internal war that shaped Colombian society for over half a century. To truly understand the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, we must begin with the roots of rural unrest in Colombia's mid-20th century political landscape. The seeds of conflict were sown during a brutal era known as La Violencia, which lasted from 1948 to 1958. This period of extreme political violence followed the assassination of liberal leader Jorge Eliezer Gaitán in Bogotá. The aftermath, known as El Bogotazo, triggered massive riots and plunged the nation into chaos. Over 200,000 people were killed during this time in a largely bipartisan civil conflict between Colombia's liberal and conservative parties. Following this era, rural self-defense groups began to emerge, particularly in marginalized peasant communities that had long been neglected by the state. These groups gradually organized into more formal revolutionary movements. In 1964, the most prominent among them consolidated into what became the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia People's Army, a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla movement seeking to overthrow the government and implement socialist agrarian reform. Other insurgent groups also emerged, such as the National Liberation Army, a movement with ideological alignment toward Cuban-style communism, though their strategies differed. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia grounded its ideology in Marxism-Leninism, drawing heavily from Soviet and Cuban revolutionary theory. The organization viewed Colombia's capitalist structure as a system that exploited the working class, especially rural peasants, Afro-Colombians, and indigenous populations. The movement argued that meaningful change was only possible through armed revolution. Its fighters initially operated in remote rural zones, building parallel institutions such as health services, local courts, and educational programs. However, their ideological mission would become entangled with more pragmatic survival strategies. By the 1980s, Colombia had become a key node in the global cocaine trade. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia began to collect revolutionary taxes from coca growers and traffickers. Eventually, the organization began actively protecting cocaine routes and laboratories, becoming deeply embedded in narcotics trafficking. This move was controversial both within and outside the group. Some saw it as a betrayal of revolutionary principles, while others argued it was necessary to sustain the war effort. The government of the Republic of Colombia responded with a combination of military campaigns and failed peace efforts. Yet, in many rural areas, the state remained weak or absent, allowing guerrilla and paramilitary actors to dominate. During the 1980s and 1992, powerful right-wing paramilitary groups emerged, most notably the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, a coalition of local militias formed by landowners, drug traffickers, and some members of the security apparatus. These groups were created to counter guerrilla influence, but quickly became involved in their own campaigns of terror, including massacres, political assassinations, and forced displacement. Civilians were often caught in the middle or targeted deliberately for suspected sympathies. By the early 2000s, Colombia's internal war had evolved into a three-sided conflict: the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the government of the Republic of Colombia, and paramilitary forces, all of whom contributed to violence and mass suffering. In response, the United States government launched Plan Colombia into a multi-billion-dollar aid initiative aimed at combating narcotics and insurgency. While militarily effective, it led to increased human rights abuses and environmental destruction due to aerial fumigation of coca fields. In the late 1990s, President Ender S. Pastrana Arango attempted to negotiate peace by establishing a demilitarized zone for dialogue with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. However, the group used the opportunity to regroup militarily and expand its operations. Talks broke down in 2002, and trust between the two parties disintegrated. This failure paved the way for President Álvaro Uribe Vélez to launch a hardline security doctrine known as democratic security. Under his administration, the military was significantly expanded and offensive operations intensified. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia suffered major setbacks, including the killing or capture of numerous senior commanders. The government reclaimed territory and reduced guerrilla influence in many areas. Despite these victories, the underlying social conditions that gave rise to the conflict, such as land inequality, rural marginalization, and political exclusion, remained largely unaddressed. In 2010, President Juan Manuel Santos Calderón, a former defense minister under Uribe, shifted course. He prioritized peace and launched formal negotiations with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia in 2012, hosted in Havana, Cuba. The talks addressed 5 major themes: land reform, political participation, narcotics eradication, transitional justice, and the reintegration of former combatants into civil society. After 4 years, in 2016, the two parties signed a comprehensive peace agreement. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia agreed to disarm, demobilize, and transition into a political party renamed the Common Alternative Revolutionary Force, though many continued to refer to it by its original name. However, the peace process faced resistance. A national referendum narrowly rejected the agreement. Critics, especially supporters of former President Uribe, argued that it offered impunity to war criminals. A revised version of the agreement was eventually ratified by the Colombian Congress, and President Santos was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. Although the war with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia officially ended, peace in Colombia remains fragile. Several dissident groups have refused to demobilize or have returned to armed activity. Other armed organizations, including the National Liberation Army and powerful narcotics cartels, have moved to occupy territories formerly controlled by the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. Meanwhile, hundreds of social leaders, human rights defenders, and ex-combatants have been assassinated in recent years. Rural communities remain vulnerable, and full implementation of the peace accords has been inconsistent. The Colombian Civil War was not just a rebellion, it was a mirror reflecting systemic inequalities, international interventions, and the blurred lines between ideology and profit. Peace in Colombia is not a destination. It is a long, arduous journey that continues today. If you appreciated this deep dive, subscribe and let us know which conflict you'd like to explore next.